My name is Rabbi Howard Morrison, and this is my shul, Beth Emet Beis Yehuda Synagogue. But I want to tell you, it gives me special delight when synagogues can come together and share what we have in common. Because ultimately, all Jews and all synagogues share much more in common than that which is not in common. And I believe we need to spend more time promoting that we are all Jews. We are all one and the same. And like any good Jewish family, here and there we disagree on a few details. It is with great pleasure that Beth Emet Beis Yehuda partners with our sister congregation, Beth Tzedek congregation. Just as a parenthetical aside, I have known Rabbi Baruch Friedman Cole for many, many years. Long before I came here to Beth Emet 15 years ago, I consider him a teacher, a colleague, and a friend. And for those who don't know it, Rabbi Adam Cutler grew up as a child coming to this synagogue and actually sat on my search committee interviewing me, representing USY at the time, some 16 years ago. And now I got him back. He's a rabbi too. Welcome, everybody, to the Sam and Sarah Kirsner Holocaust Memorial Institute Scholar Weekend, featuring Professor Stephen Berk. Tonight's theme is just part one of a whole Shabbaton and weekend of learning and enrichment. The entire weekend is entitled 70 Years After Auschwitz. Tonight's topic, 70 years later, the Second World War in historical perspective. And then the learning will continue at Beth Tzedek tomorrow evening with Kabbalat Shabbat at 6:30. The topic is entitled Putin, the Practice of Power. Then on Shabbat morning during services at Beth Tzedek, and services begin at 8:45. So if you ask what time will the professor be speaking, he will be speaking at the service which begins at 8:45. And his topic is entitled A Tale of Two Elections, Israel and the United States. And then on Sunday morning, also at Beth Tzedek, at a breakfast at 9:30, for which there is no charge, and the lecture begins at 10 o'clock, his topic is entitled After 70 Years, Auschwitz and Anti-Semitism. I encourage all of us to participate in as much of this program as possible. The more we put in, the more we will receive in turn. At this time, with great pleasure, to offer greetings and welcome, I call upon our Beth Emet Beis Yehuda President, Bernie Schultz.
Good evening. 5 months ago, on January 27th, the world marked the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. In the months and years following the end of World War II, many Holocaust survivors left Europe in the hopes of making new homes for themselves in cities around the world. Toronto was one such place. As survivors began the process of rebuilding their lives, many recognized the importance of creating a synagogue. Within 10 years of the end of World War II, Beth Emet Synagogue was established to meet the spiritual and community needs of the residents of Bathurst Manor, so many of whom were survivors of the Shoah. In addition to those founding members who were survivors, other founding members who grew up in Toronto had their own vivid memories of the anti-Semitism that was rife in Canada at the time. Even within the ranks of the federal government, where the unofficial immigration policy towards Jews was none is too many. This year, Beth Emet celebrates its 60th anniversary, and as you've seen before, our tagline is honoring the past, celebrating the present, and building the future. Tonight, as we proudly host this important program, we reflect on our past by honoring the memory of those that perished in the Shoah and those that survived. I would like to thank Michael and Rochelle Kirsner for their generous sponsorship of this evening's lecture. On behalf of the board and executive of Beth Emeth Beis Yehuda Synagogue, it is my privilege to bring warm greetings and to welcome you all here tonight.
Good evening. The Sam and Sarah Kersner Holocaust Studies Institute were originally endowed in the mid-1980s at Beth Tzedek congregation by my father and his siblings in order to leave a lasting legacy on the values of community and philanthropy that were taught to them by their parents. They were urged at the time by the late Jack Ornstein of blessed memory, the longtime executive director of Beth Tzedek, to dedicate this lecture series so that for the children and the grandchildren, their memories would be preserved. And my grandparents were products of their own times. They were humble and unassuming people who came to Canada in 1930 with literally nothing, and believed in part that a person does not always have to be in the limelight, nor need recognition for something they were intrinsically responsible for. And they raised their 7 children at the end at 116 Dewborn Avenue. And they were pioneers in many ways. They ran fundraisers out of their cramped living room for their landsmen left behind in Stubnitz, Poland. And yet they became part of the Toronto Jewish community fabric, adhering to the spirit of Prophet Micah that we should do justly and love mercy and walk humbly in the eyes of our God. I'm truly delighted that we bring the lecture series here tonight to Beth Emeth, a congregation founded by many survivors of the Shoah 60 years ago, as the President said, just 10 years after the Shoah. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here tonight and hope that the weekend enriches our own lives by learning from the past.
It is a personal pleasure to be back here at Beth Emeth, having a moment, even for a minute or two, to speak to you in this august room, in this very special building. When you find a treasure, you want to hold it close, and you want to keep it to yourself for a very long time. But at some moment, you also want to let go and share it with the world. And for us at Beth Tzedek, we've known for many years that Stephen Berk is very much a treasure. He has been coming to our synagogue for since well before I became one of the rabbis there, and frankly since almost as long as I've been alive, which is longer than you think. Professor Stephen Berk teaches at Union College in Schenectady, New York, where he is a professor in the Department of History. I have to imagine that only at Union College is the most popular course on campus the course on the Holocaust. And it's not because the students at Union are especially interested in that terrible moment in our history. The course is so popular because of the lecturer, and that is Professor Stephen Berk. Anyone who has ever heard him knows he is a man who speaks from the heart, whose mind is filled with tremendous knowledge, and whose warm embrace is there's just no word for it. When he speaks, people simply listen. And I know that tonight you will all be listening. I want to mention one other treasure as well. And the other treasure who I want to mention is Joe Kersner. Joe Kersner, who was past president of Beth Tzedek, passed away a few months ago. And it was together with his brothers Morris and Louis and Max and Albert that this lecture series, the Sam and Sarah Kersner Holocaust Memorial Institute, was founded. And Joe was truly a man of warmth and integrity and kindness and ethics. And while we all have the privilege of listening to Professor Berk this evening and hopefully throughout the weekend, I know many of us have had the great privilege of knowing Joe Kersner will also be thinking of him throughout. So without further ado, Professor Berk, we are very excited to hear your lecture this evening.
Thank you, Rabbi Cutler. Now, listen to me. My wife is here, and she knows that I'm no Messiah. That was a very, very nice introduction. If my students were here, I can tell you how they would respond. One would turn to the other and say, that Prof. Berk, he's a legend in his own mind. That's what it is. But it is a pleasure to be here. I thank the Kersner family, and I remember very fondly Joe Kersner. It is 70 years since the end of the Second World War. 70 years gives us a sense of perspective. New people look at an old event, they look at it with new eyes, and we have more information than we've ever had before. So 70 years is a good time to look back. And so what I'm going to do, and again, I am not the prophet from Union College. I do not have a monopoly on the truth. Let me tell you what I think were the most important or salient aspects of the war, and then talk about the consequences of the war. I begin by saying to you what we all already know, and that is what we were taught in the 50s and the 60s, which essentially is correct. And that is, the war marks probably the greatest failure of democracy in the 20th century. Succinctly put, Hitler could have been stopped early on. When he marched into the Rhineland in March of 1936, the German army had few tanks and few planes. The German army probably could not mobilize more than 250,000 men. France and Great Britain could have stopped him dead in his tracks. They also could have stopped him in March of 1938, when Hitler carried out the Anschluss, the illegal incorporation of Austria. They backed down. In a failure of democracy, this is perhaps the most glaring failure. Remember, when I tell my students this, they think I'm talking about ancient history. But I see from looking out at you, there are people who either remember it directly or are really familiar with it one way or another. In the summer of 1938, Adolf Hitler declared to the world, and particularly to Czechoslovakia, if I do not get the Sudetenland, the westernmost part of Czechoslovakia inhabited by 3 million German speakers, I will go to war. France and Britain were tied by military alliance to Czechoslovakia. Yet they offered up Czechoslovakia on the altar of international peace. They sacrificed Czechoslovakia, believing that Hitler could be deterred from war. War over Czechoslovakia, perhaps war forever. Some of you may remember when I was in high school, back in the 50s, we used to see the films. Some of you may have seen the films at the time. There's Neville Chamberlain, arriving at the airport in London, holding up a piece of paper, and telling the reporters, I have brought you peace in our time. And the reporters responded, 3 cheers for the Prime Minister, hip hip hooray, hip hip hooray, hip hip hooray. And Hitler, never modest to begin with, when Daladier of France and Chamberlain of Great Britain left his office, and left the building and left Munich, he walked out of his office and said to his secretaries, quote, girls, come and kiss me. I am the greatest German of them all, end quote. But again, the Fuhrer, never modest, believes now he is infallible. And his Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, would spread the myth of the Fuhrer's infallibility. That's important. He could have been stopped. What we now know, and we learned this about 20 to 30 years after the war, is that there were German generals who were planning a coup against Adolf Hitler. Not because of his anti-Semitism, not because of his totalitarian nature and what he was doing to Germany domestically, but because they thought Hitler was leading Germany into a ruinous war that Germany could not win. But every time the conspiracy of the generals gets off the ground, the Allies capitulate, again and again and again. Nothing succeeds like success. Hitler seems to go from victory to victory, and it is remarkable, I must tell you. This man who never got past the 9th grade, who spoke no language outside of German, who never rose above the rank of corporal, this man understood what his people wanted, and this man understood the acute paralysis of will in the West. That is, the West would not fight. The democracies would not fight. And so, a war that did not have to come is going to come, and when it is finished, in Europe, we are talking probably about somewhere between 30 and 40 million dead, including 6 million Jews. So that's the first thing that I would say as we look back on that terrible period. The second is something that they don't talk about in the United States very much, and I suspect they don't talk about or speak about very much in Canada. Listen to these figures. The Germans lost 5 million combat deaths in the Second World War. 4,500,000 were lost on the Eastern Front. For all of the efforts of the American, the British, the Canadian, the Free French armies, we accounted for only 500,000 German dead. What I'm trying to tell you is not a popular thing to say in any country in the West, whether it is Canada or the United States, is that the Soviet Union was primarily responsible for the victory over the Nazis. Again, I know where I'm standing, so I have to watch my language. Stalin was a bad man. I mean, that's an understatement. But there is no question that without the Soviet Union, which incidentally lost 27 million dead in the Second World War, there is no victory. And as I assume most of you, if not all of you, know, on that day, January 27th of 1945, when Auschwitz was liberated, it was not the American army, it was not the Canadian army, it was not the British army, it was not the French army, it was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz and all of the death camps and most of the concentration camps and labor camps. I must tell you, in the eyes of my colleagues, I'm a Neanderthal man. I'm center and center right in my politics. No one would ever accuse me of being an apologist for Stalin or the Soviet Union. But fair is fair. The Red Army liberated Europe. It deserves most of the credit. A third incident here, or a third element here. Again, I am an American, a citizen of the United States, but I'm not an American chauvinist. But I will tell you, any reckoning of the Second World War has to factor in the tremendous industrial production of the United States. By 1944, the United States was producing 120,000 planes a year, 80,000 tanks, and day after day those ships came off the shipyards. We will help feed, clothe, provide the Soviet Union, the Red Army, with trucks. We will feed together, in Canada will play a role in this as well. But the fact of the matter is, American military production is absolutely tremendous, and that too has to be factored in. And number four, as everyone knows, certainly this audience knows, you cannot talk about the Second World War without the role of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was a political ideology that mobilized by Hitler. He was able to use anti-Semitism as a political weapon to mobilize German masses in order to really gain power and in order to hold on to power. Now, when I say that, don't make the mistake of thinking, as some people thought at the time, that Hitler was a cynical manipulator of the masses of the German people, and that he really didn't care much about the Jews, didn't care much about anti-Semitism. That is Narishkeit. That is absolute nonsense. Everything we know tells us that Adolf Hitler, again, here you see the limits of the historian. I can tell you that Hitler hated the Jews to his very core. He didn't coin an expression. If any of you have ever seen films of Nazi rallies, you see the slogan that appears all over, and he used it all the time. People thought he coined the slogan. He did not. The slogan was coined in the 1870s by an anti-Semitic German historian. But Hitler used it all the time, and he believed it. Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. The Jews stabbed Germany in the back in 1918. The Jews brought communism. The Jews brought inflation. The Jews brought depression. That's what Hitler truly believed. And he's going to convince large numbers of Germans that the Jews were indeed the seed of all evil. By 1941, Hitler's rhetoric is changing. He's telling the German people, not what he used to tell them. He continued to say that. The Jews did X, Y, and Z to us. But then he went on to say, as I am speaking to you, Hitler said to the Germans, as I am speaking to you, the Jews are trying to destroy Germany. This man Churchill, he's manipulated by the Jews. This President Roosevelt, he's either Jewish or he's being manipulated by the Jews. Wherever we are fighting, Hitler said, the Jews are behind the attack upon Germany. Anti-Semitism goes beyond that. Anti-Semitism, of course, will pave the road to Auschwitz. We all know that. But something else, and this we understand a little bit more now. There was so much anti-Semitism in the West, in France, in Great Britain, in Canada, and in the United States, that leaders of the Jewish community were reluctant to go in the forefront in bringing in Jewish immigrants. Because the argument that was raised in a number of countries, look at the damn Jews, one of the most famous Americans, the greatest American hero of the pre-World War II period, Charles Lindbergh. You know what Lindbergh said about the Jews? They're trying to suck us into a war. They're more concerned with their co-religionists in Europe than they are with the well-being of the United States. In France, too, the argument was the Jews want to suck us into another war because they're only concerned with the welfare of the German Jewish community. That, of course, was absolute nonsense. But it is important. It is important in understanding that anti-Semitism, why a Canadian minister said none is too many, right? And because an American government, for all intents and purposes, will close the gates to hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. The gates were closing right at the time that the apocalypse was descending upon our people in Europe because of the widespread anti-Semitism. Put the anti-Semitism on top of the Depression, and you can understand. You cannot exonerate. Never let explication become exoneration. But we understand now why people didn't open the gates. So, there are other things as well about the war. Again, I tell my students the first day of every class, you want to talk about ideas, bring about historical change, of course. I'm not a Marxist, but class and economics are important. I tell the students, never, never, never minimize the role of personality in history. You can talk all you want about the underlying forces leading to the Second World War. If Hitler is not there, the Nazis do not come to power. If Hitler is not there, there's no Second World War. If Hitler is not there, there's no Holocaust. Yes, there were many German Nazis. They were all anti-Semites. But no one had, for want of a better expression, the charisma, the political genius that Adolf Hitler had. Here I give you a parenthesis. It's one of the ironies of the 20th century that the two politicians that were probably most in sync with their populations were the anti-democrats. Lenin in Russia and Hitler in Germany, bless you. The result is going to be, these men are going to come to power, they will mobilize the masses, and they will go about doing their business. In the case of Hitler, the business is, among other things, murdering the Jews. Put another way, if God forbid, the spirit of Hitler walked through that door, and I said to him, I'll say with the British, how they used to address him before the Second World War, they used to call him Herr Hitler. Herr Hitler, I said, what was the primary war aim of the Third Reich? You could bet your last Canadian dollar that he would have said, if not the major war aim, one of the three major war aims, we wanted to make Europe Judenrein. We wanted to make Europe clean of Jews. And I'm telling you, you cannot understand the Second World War without that. In addition to that, there are other men who play a role. Today, Winston Churchill does not come off looking as good as he did for the preceding 50 years. There are a number of reasons for this. First, give credit again where credit is due. That is, he led England in its finest hour. He inspired the British people. He was unflagging in his desire to bring the war to a victorious end. But every crackpot scheme that was devised by the British government emanated from Winston Churchill. Churchill had crackpot scheme after crackpot scheme. We're going to invade through the Balkans, for example. Things like that. Absolutely loony. And it is his generals who will bridle it. And besides, on a more serious vein, it's hard to believe there's anything more serious than this, it's very interesting that the President of the United States, a black man, took the bust of Winston Churchill out of the Oval Office and put it in the basement. If you are white, and if you are Jewish, Winston Churchill is the best thing since sliced bread. But if you are an Indian, then it looks a little bit different. If you are an African, it looks a little bit different. There was a terrible famine in the Bengal. And British officials in India, together with Indian officials, pleaded with Churchill. You've got to allocate some food. You've got to give us food. The food will not come. And 3 million Indians are going to die. That's a problem. And if you lived in Kenya, where Barack Obama's father came from, or you lived in some of the other British colonies, where the British fought tenaciously, at least for some period of time, Winston Churchill doesn't look so good. But again, when it comes to the war, and it comes to that incredible 18 months, when France had fallen, the Russians were not yet involved in the war, the United States was caught up in isolationism, that man, Winston Churchill, steeled the backbone of the British people and made it clear that England would not surrender, would not arrange for a separate peace, that England would fight the Nazis down to the bitter end. And there were other things. Things that we now know, again, that we certainly did not know for about 25 years after the Second World War. Those men and women in Bletchley Park, including probably about 28 Jews, that broke the German codes, probably saved the lives of hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers. Any book on the Second World War written before 1970 is obsolete, because it was only in 1970 that the British released the data about, again, about what was called ultra, that is the ability to break the German codes. Very, very important stuff. And finally, you can't talk. If I talk about personality in history, you can talk about Stalin, a lousy war leader in the beginning, but a very good war leader at the end. Hitler, a miserable war leader. An absolutely miserable war leader. The German war effort was not fought efficiently. German generals were good. German soldiers were highly motivated. But Hitler was a bad war leader. Operation Barbarossa, June 22nd, 1941. Crazy for the Germans to invade the Soviet Union. Crazy. And for those of you that like hypothetical history, this would resonate more in an American audience. But even a Canadian audience, I think, would understand what I'm talking about. December 7th, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. December 8th, Roosevelt declares war on Japan. December 11th, Hitler declares war on the United States. The damn fool. What would have happened had Hitler said, this is between you and the Japanese. Germany has nothing to do with it. A public opinion poll in the United States on December 1st of 1941 revealed that only 20% of the American people were prepared to enter the Second World War. If Pearl Harbor had not taken place, it's not clear that Roosevelt could have brought the United States into war. If Hitler had said, this is not our war, we had nothing to do with it, we only want peace with the United States, I'm not sure Roosevelt could have brought our country into the war. And then, personality again. You can't, in the end, it's our young men and women against their young men and women. In the end, there is no victory. There is no victory without courage and bravery. I tell my students on the last day of a World War II class, and certainly the last day of a Holocaust class, one of the things you learn about the Holocaust and about the war is how much we cheapen the words hero, heroine, and heroism. I tell the students, I'll tell you, lighten this up. Look at me well. Would you believe that 50 years ago and 50 pounds ago, I was a jock? I was really good. I ran track. I only mention this to you because I love athletics. I really do. I watch the stuff on television. But athletes are not heroes. And great entertainers are not heroes. You study the Second World War, you study the Holocaust, and you know what heroes and heroism is all about. Before the war, remember, on June 6th of 1944, American soldiers land at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach. Canadian soldiers land at Juno Beach. You know what heroism is? You're in the Higgins boat, taking you to the shores of Normandy, the beaches of Normandy. And the sergeant major says, 30 seconds and the ramp goes down. And you see the German machine gun bullets skimming across the water. And you see the German artillery blasting up the water. And when that ramp goes down, you charge into that fire. That's what heroism is about. And unless there was that heroism, there's no victory in the Second World War. For Canadians, the bravery of the First World War continues into the Second World War. Close to 4,000 Canadian soldiers will either be killed or wounded in one brief battle, the Battle of Dieppe, in the middle of 1942. A mistake, a terrible mistake. They say they learned lessons. They thought they were probing a German weak point. The Germans fight, and there are almost 4,000 Canadian casualties. And on the morning of June 6th, the Canadians do equally well, only this time it's a victory. And you should know, if you do not know it, the first captured Allied soldiers that were murdered by the Germans after they surrendered, right after the invasion of Normandy, were 21 Canadian soldiers. So without the bravery, there is no victory. Now the consequences. Again, 70 years. What's the immediate consequence? The Red Army is in Eastern Europe. I told you the Red Army plays the major role in liberating Europe. What did our parents and grandparents tell us when we were children? You can't have your cake and eat it, right? Churchill tells Roosevelt in the spring of 1942, American generals are crazy and British generals are not far behind. That is, the generals of both countries wanted to invade Europe in the autumn of 1942. And Churchill tells Roosevelt and convinces Roosevelt, you can't do it. We don't have the men. The German army is too strong. The German Air Force is too strong. We've got to attack the Germans on the periphery. First North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. Then, when we clear the Luftwaffe from the sky and we pulverize German industry, then we invade. That's the correct call. But you can't have your cake and eat it. If you delay the Second Front until June 6th of 1944, and the Red Army after Stalingrad is pushing the Germans back, it means the Germans are in Eastern Europe. Excuse me, the Red Army is in Eastern Europe. The Red Army will be in Czechoslovakia, in Poland and Hungary. The Red Army is prepared, together with the NKVD, to communize and Sovietize Eastern Europe. And all of our complaining after the Second World War is not going to change the situation. We are so concerned with casualties. That's what a democratic country is concerned with, and it should be. We are so concerned with casualties, we delay the Second Front and allow Stalin to dominate Eastern Europe. And then the issue is, he's got 150 Red Army divisions in Eastern Europe. Is he going to move from Eastern Europe across Europe to the English Channel? Is he going to take all of Europe and Sovietize it? That's what the Cold War is all about. Today, historians and political scientists, they all debate whether Stalin was really on the march.
You got to use it more.
Whether he's really on the march. That's what the Cold War is all about. In my country, it leads to hysteria. The Hollywood blacklist. The first Senator McCarthy. So the Cold War is important, and it's a consequence of the war. So, too, is the disintegration of the empires. The British Empire is no more. The Dutch are the first to feel it. What used to be called the Dutch East Indies after a revolt becomes Indonesia. The French will lose eventually Algeria. The British will lose Kenya. The British will also, of course, I'll use an old American expression, are going to throw in the towel about Palestine. That's a consequence of the war. Now, let's not extrapolate. It's got to be a cold day in July. You gotta have 15 inches of snow in Toronto in the middle of July before I will tell you that the Holocaust created the state of Israel, and that some people believe you can even justify the Holocaust, part of God's plan. That is nonsense. There would have been a state of Israel, Second World War or no Second World War. But there is no question that the Holocaust accelerates it. Because the flow of Jews before the war, anti-Semitism in Europe, perceived is the impetus for the flow. The going to Israel after the war, the support that Israel or Zionism will have after the war, all of these things can be traced to the Second World War. Once again, I'm telling you, so no one will mistake what I'm saying. There would have been a state of Israel without the Second World War and without the Holocaust, but it would not have come in 1948. And then, again, here I speak about my own country. There's no question, 600,000 Jews served in the armed forces of the United States. Before 1939, the American Jewish community, not like the Canadian Jewish community, we are different in many ways, was a-Zionist. That is, most Americans didn't give a damn about the Yishuv, the Jewish settlement in Palestine. The war changes that. The wars and the Holocaust Zionize American society. Golda Meir, Meyerson at the time, is sent by David Ben-Gurion to raise $5 million in the United States. She returns to Palestine with $50 million. After Auschwitz, the question is raised in Jewish communities all over. How can you deny the need for a Jewish state? So there is a correspondence, there is a relationship here between all of this, between the war and what's going to happen after the war. And then, every time you get on a jet plane, it's because of the war. By the end of 1944, the Germans were throwing up the only jets in the Second World War, the Messerschmitt 262. Heaven help the American, the Canadian, or the British pilot that ran into one of those jets. It is our bombing of their petroleum supplies, their gasoline supplies, that made sure that those planes didn't stay up in the air very, very long. So jet aircraft, once the Germans have it, everybody wants it. And once they develop jet military aircraft, it's not a giant step to develop, of course, transport planes, or let us say, civilian planes that have jets. And again, as I tell the students, now, I could ask you the same question, but we want to finish by Shavuos, but you'll give me the right answer anyway, and that is this. Is there anybody in this room that has not once in his life, child's life, once in the grandchildren's life, is there anybody in this room that can say you never had a strep throat? We all get strep throats. Before the Second World War, there was no effective treatment for a strep throat. Or, to bring it closer to home, you know what they used to call pneumonia? First of all, they used to call pneumonia the old man's friend. But the other name, the more elegant name for pneumonia, captain of the host of death. 1 out of every 2 people who got pneumonia before the Second World War died. Unfortunately, people still die of pneumonia, but far fewer because of antibiotics. Antibiotics are a consequence of the war. The computer is a consequence of the war. What I'm trying to tell you is the war changed absolutely everything. Leon Trotsky, the great Russian revolutionary, used to say, war is the locomotive of history. I tell my students, war is the midwife of history. The war changed everything. And so, if a historian has the chutzpah to look a little bit forward, I always tell people, hey, what's going to be? Like I know what's going to be. I'm not a Novi, I'm not a prophet. I'm a historian. I'm lucky if I get the past right. If they talk to what's going to happen in the future, again. But everybody wants to know. The only thing that I will say with any certainty is that the events and the political leaders, some of whom we mentioned in the 20th century, shaped our lives for the 21st century. The surest thing in this world is, for our children, our grandchildren, our grandchildren, every century produces its own challenges. There will be new events. There will be new political leaders. And the challenges in a nuclear age are greater than they ever have been before. One can only hope, one can only pray that those who come after us, those who inherit us, our children, our grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, that they will have the courage, the intellectual capacity to deal with the great problems that will confront people in the 21st century. If they do, then we go on. If they do not, then we are in for some real bloodbaths and some real terror. I remain positive on this. My wife would tell you I'm a pessimist by nature, but I'm telling you, when it comes to the survival of our people, of Israel, and even of this difficultly plagued planet, in the end, I'll use the Hebrew expression. In the end, I tell you, I've given you a somber subject, talked about death, 6 million Jews, 27 million Russians, 40 million Europeans. In the end, we go on and on. In the end, I'm telling you, Yetov. In the end, by the grace of God and by the courage of those who come after us, it will be good. Thank you very much.
We have some time now to take some questions. Don't worry, audience, if you can't hear the question, either myself or Professor Berk will repeat it. Standard rules apply. Please make your questions questions. And if they require some sort of introductory context, you get one and, you get one semicolon, and you get 15 seconds. We're on the same page? Okay. Back to the room.
If you could choose one of the following for this future entity to answer this question, who would it be? China, Putin, or Islam?
The question is, if I had to choose which of the great problems that will confront us, I will talk about Putin tomorrow night. Let me just say to you, he's flesh and blood. He's going to die someday. And he's playing, I will say this tomorrow, but we'll not develop it now. He's playing a weak hand very, very well. But you can only get away with that for a certain period of time. In the short run, Putin is a problem. Radical Islam is a major problem. There is no question about that. Radical Islam is a problem. We are dealing with people who have no moral bottom. That is, I'm saying to you, if some of these Muslim extremists, if they in fact could acquire a nuclear weapon, they would use it. So radical Islam is a problem. China is a problem. Over the long run, again, this is where skilled diplomacy must come in. China is branching out into the South China Sea and into the East China Sea. The Chinese are flexing their muscles. There is no question about that. And the question is, for those who lead Great Britain, Canada, France, and the United States, and the Bundesrepublik, the question is, can we have both the strength, the courage, and the intellectual or diplomatic skill to accommodate ourselves to a resurgent China? But I must tell you, for those of you who think